We are very, very lucky to have been joined by our panel, the panel that are legally allowed to be in galleries and the panel that are not. And we're going to be kind of exploring the kind of socialized powerlessness that we are taught, and especially in the UK, to say that we cannot change things. And that's the kind of whole point of this residency that I've come down from Glasgow to do, is exploring different ways of not just learning, but unlearning otherwise. Because if we're going to take the climate crisis seriously and we're going to respond to all the societal challenges that we're facing, it's not just going to be about learning things on top of the system we have, just adding to knowledges that came from modernist and colonial imaginaries. It's going to be about unlearning them as well. So even just to kind of begin, we'll start going through who we have on the panel. So we've unintentionally done this in order, really nicely left to right. So just to begin, first we're going to welcome Aska Welford, they and them. So Aska is an architectural worker at UVW and has been elected to sit on the executive committee as a branch representative. They've been part of UVW SAW since it started and facilitated the workers' inquiry which led to it. As part of SAW, they've also supported other workers in employment issues, particularly around sexism and racism in the workplace, as well as campaigning against the proposed changes to the building regulations harming trans and gender non-conforming people. They're interested in the way that workers collaborate across different personal identity and experiences to imagine different futures for the organising conversation, which offers a pragmatic way of putting more liberated worlds into practice. So to break all the ice, we're going to welcome each person with a round of applause. So we're going to welcome Aska first of all. And then to Aska's right, we have Martha Dillon, she and her. Martha is housing policy lead at campaigning think tank Positive Money, which was launched following the 2008 crash to call for a sustainable, democratic and fair money banking system. She also runs It's Freezing in LA, a magazine dedicated to radical ecological ideas and platforming underrepresented and new voices in the climate movement. So, Martha's round of applause and welcome. And to Martha's right, we have Tom Bennett, he and him. Tom Bennett is an architect at London-based Studio Bark. Tom became politically active as a student since around 2006, and has been engaged in environmental activism of various kinds ever since. In April 2019, Tom took part in mass civil civil disobedience coordinated by Extinction Rebellion, earning a criminal record from Her Majesty's court system. Later that same year, he helped to launch the Architects Climate Action Network, which is now known quite commonly as ACAN. More recently, Tom has been involved in Project Bunny Rabbit, a collective of beatniks, artists, and troublemakers behind various tin secretary installations, including the 2021 Anti-Pavilion all along the Watchtower. So we're going to welcome Tom. And out of the last of our panelists, so we're also going to get to why Phoebe is on screen. So Phoebe is a social anthropology student from London and a supporter of Just Stop Oil. They have taken action 8 times, including smashing petrol pumps, throwing soup on Van Gogh's sunflowers, and the M25 gantry action, following which they spent 28 days on remand at HMP Bronzefield and was an ankle curfew for 3 months. They are joining over Zoom because they have bail conditions not to go into any art galleries. So we're going to welcome Phoebe. Right. So thank you everyone for giving the time towards coming and for wanting to explore this kind of subject, because this is something the built environment we don't really do. We do sustainability, which basically translates to damage control. Our norm is we're part of an industry that contributes between 40 and 50% of environmental harm, and we don't take the kind of responsibility for that we can and should. And when it comes to the built environment, we have a complete scarcity of activists. There are simply not enough of us. Personally, I've done over 100 talks, and I've taught for 22 universities, which is insane because that's how big the failure demand is in the system. So even just to kind of introduce everyone, we'll go in the same order again. Just even in talking about how, we're going to talk about ways of an agency and the phrase of kind of stepping into the power that you have. So Aska, with your kind of experience with UVW SAW, how did you first kind of start getting involved, and what was the kind of the click moment that kind of pushed that first step as well?
So speed me up if I go on for too long, but I'm going to start off by talking about my experiences in practice as an architectural worker. Then I'm going to talk about the process of doing a works inquiry and then setting up a branch of the Architectural Workers Union, UVW SAW. So I started work as a part one in a social housing practice, and I grew up in social housing. I think social housing is really important, but I quite quickly realised that the parameters for my work were already set. So working on a master plan for redeveloping a particular estate in East London, if I wanted to propose like, why aren't we speaking to the residents, or why aren't we looking at things like infill or refurbishment rather than like treating the site like a blank slate, I was told, don't be political. And yeah, other times it would be just like, okay, yeah, you can work out those options, sort of inherently devaluing, seeing the site as a space where people live. At the same time of that, I was feeling kind of frustrated about, being quite complicit in environmentally and ethically problematic projects, being overworked and underpaid. And across the part ones of my practice, we found a really big pay gap in terms of gender, race, class, what kind of university you went to. So we got together and asked for a pay rise to match the highest paid part one. We did all the right things in terms of like justifying it to our bosses, looking at the living wage, looking at the REBA pay scale, kind of pleading like this really isn't enough money to pay for exorbitant rents in London. And it was really interesting, the response. At that time, there wasn't a union, and our boss, we got this sharp reminder of how disposable you are. If you haven't worked at a practice for more than 2 years in the UK, you don't have any redundancy rights. So the boss wasn't exactly pleased. He was, I guess, frustrated that these pesky part ones were talking to each other and essentially costing him just a few more grand each year. So on the day of the Christmas party, one of my friends and colleagues got fired for asking for a pay rise in line with other part ones. So we had two things to be angry about: the kind of ethical impact of the work that we were doing in practice, which, try as we might to do a better drawing or make a better model, we still weren't really allowed to talk about those bigger issues. And then on the flip side of that, things like our pay and working conditions, us being workers, those two things became really intimately connected. Unionizing, we had this kind of magical word at lunchtimes or at the pub after work. I felt a little bit mythical, like, union could totally fix this, but none of us really knew what it was. So we did a workers' inquiry, which has over 100 years of tradition from Marx's 100 Questions. It's basically a history of study from below. So workers get together across different sectors and say, what are the issues facing us? What are the biggest problems? We know our sector best, and we know how to change it. So we did a workers' inquiry in architecture. We found out the big issues that we share, things like bullying, mental health, overwork, underpay, the ethical impact of the work that we're doing. And in 2019, we formed a branch of UVW, so United Voices of the World. It's a trade union that numbers among it sex workers, cleaners, legal workers, design and cultural workers, hospitality workers, and now, architectural workers. So traditionally ununionizable sectors. I think I'll stop there.
Oh, that's fantastic. Thank you very much. So we'll pass to Phoebe outside of the room. So just to kind of ask, what was the moment for you which led to you taking action how you have? And what is the kind of the why behind it as well for you, kind of beyond that?
So I first took action with Just Stop Oil in August, and I'd been doing some kind of environment or aware of the climate crisis before that, and I've been doing the traditional things that I guess a lot of us have tried before stepping into civil resistance. I've signed more petitions than I have bones in my body. I've written more letters to my MPs than I can even begin to count. And I learned the hard way that these things are too easily ignored. For 50 years, climate activists and scientists have been trying those non-disruptive forms of action here in the UK, whilst we've known about the realities of the climate crisis. And I took action right after the UK hit 40 degrees. I think the scale of the crisis we're facing is so huge that it's sometimes hard to comprehend. I can't imagine what 1 billion or 2 billion climate refugees looks like. I can't imagine the city where I grew up lying underwater. But as I was walking my dog on Clapham Common that summer, it was so clear to me the devastation we were causing. All the grass had died, the leaves had turned orange and fallen from the trees. Never seen anything like it in my life. My usually infuriatingly excitable dog was so hot she could hardly walk. And all around me, and I think the thing that scared me most, was I saw people going about their daily lives as if we weren't looking straight at the destruction of all we hold dear. And I knew I couldn't be one of those people. I knew that I couldn't continue to be complicit, and I knew the non-disruptive things that I've been trying weren't working, because we're still, in the words of the United Nations, on a highway to climate hell with our foot on the accelerator. And aptly enough, I think it was a feeling of powerlessness that I'd tried everything before civil resistance and it hadn't worked. So I knew I had to step into civil resistance, and I found my power in civil resistance. It was a week after the UK hit 40 degrees that I was smashing up petrol stations, and I can promise you I've never felt more powerful than I did in that moment.
Thank you very much. So just to kind of pass on to Martha, so even, because you mentioned that before that you used to work as an engineer as well, and so what was your kind of moment of realizing that kind of in the construction industry that not only well with this agency, but we're doing this damage and kind of shielding that from ourselves as much as other people. So what was your moment of kind of changing your mind from that and the kind of the why behind it as well?
Yeah, so I wanted to be an engineer because of the climate crisis. I remember growing up being told this was happening, this is going to define me and my friends' lives. And someone told me engineering was really useful because it's sort of technology and buildings and all this stuff. And so I studied engineering, and I thought I would get into my working life and kind of help finish the job. It's sort of from the 90s. It was real, so why would it not be solved? And got to university and quickly realised that all the courses were about concrete, and no one really wanted to talk about sustainability, and if we did have a sustainability module, it never talked about people. So that was pretty worrying, and then I got into working as an engineer, and it was even worse because what you're actually designing is also often really awful. And I think it was really interesting, Phoebe, what you were saying about complicity, because I really struggled with feeling complicit, but feeling like if I left, I was giving up. And so I did leave. I couldn't keep going with working at a company which was committing this real criminal negligence in continuing to build huge concrete buildings and sustainable cities in a desert. But yeah, I also felt really guilty because I had started organising with some colleagues who are still valiantly doing it now, and I kind of felt like I gave up on them, but I couldn't sort of morally stay there. So I think that's somewhere where I've still not really found my power of, how do I do what I want to do, design spaces and think about how people live in urban environments, but in a way that is good for people and the planet. But somewhere where I guess I have found more power was about 5 years ago. Some, not even friends really, but people I kind of knew from organising in climate spaces. And I started this magazine, It's Freezing in LA. And we do two things. One is we publish radical and progressive ideas on lots of different topics. So the idea is, if you're an architect, hopefully there's interesting built environment pieces, but also maybe there's some historical pieces or political pieces that you might be interested in as well. And they're all written by kind of emerging and underrepresented voices. So we try and find people who haven't got lots of media experience and aren't being listened to, and both amplify their ideas, but also give them a bit of training, help them understand editing process and stuff like that. So that has been that feeling of being able to make something you feel proud of has been really empowering. And it's, we've tried to build a network and a community and sort of find new voices and create a space we work together, which I think is kind of what we'll probably all say is that your power comes from being around other people and making things with other people. I'll stop there.
Oh, fantastic. So we've had kind of a couple of collective kind of organising powers and one of individual. So for Tom as well, as like the first architect who had the kind of run of civil disobedience of XR, what was the, and for being active since kind of 2016, what was the kind of clicking moment for you from, I've been doing as much as I can in the built environment in my job, I need to do something else on, I need not on the side, but I need to complement that with carrying that action out. Like, what was the thought behind that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think there's a shorter sort of answer to that, and there's also a longer range answer. So I'll try to summarize the...
Somewhere in the middle.
Yeah. I think for me it's been like a process of radicalization, but in a kind of good sense. And I think that started with getting into a very deep depression at university about the state of the world. And yeah, I mean, a sense of powerlessness, a sense of being overwhelmed. And, you know, people often talk about, you know, how it's important to focus on the positive side of issues like climate change and talk about it as opportunities and so on. But for me, like, getting very depressed about the state of the environment was profoundly motivating. So that was sort of the seed, I think. And at that point, then I got involved in various things. The Camp for Climate Action, which happened sort of in the early 2000s, occupying Heathrow, occupying Kingsnorth, where the government at the time wanted to build a new coal-fired power plant, which never happened, but sounds like a crazy idea. But in 2009, that was a serious proposal. So, yeah, and I think after the financial crisis, a lot of people took their eye off the ball with regards to the environment, and I think I was somewhat guilty of that as well. But yeah, I think I'd kind of fallen into this place of feeling like the future had been foreclosed somehow, and that society had kind of given up on grappling with the climate crisis as an issue. So for me, it was a great relief, and like there was a real sense for hope when XR came on the scene, and you know, I saw there a group that was sort of grabbing society by the throat of the neck and saying, you know, we're not going to just let this happen. This is an issue. We need to face up to it. And we need to do something. And yeah, April 2019 was, I'm sure like some of you were probably there as well, and there was a real sort of different energy about the city and about the narrative around the climate crisis. And so, yeah, for me, I wanted to play some very tiny part in that by sort of taking part in it. That was sort of roughly the thought process.
Oh, fantastic. Kind of pulling those kind of threads together, with the climate crisis, it's now entirely unignorable. So like the world does not look the same as it did 2 years ago, but also feelings ranging from feeling unable to walk away. So in architecture and environment, that feeling of being unable to step away because it'll get worse without you pushing it. We have a real scarcity of people in the built environment. So we saw like a resurgence in 2020, but there are so very, very few people who are doing this. So it's even just to kind of bounce straight back along the line, Tom, what do you think it is about us specifically who work in this industry that kind of holds more people back? So to go straight into the kind of, where does that powerlessness come from? And then we can go on to Aska as well, because it'd be really interesting to know from the perspective of the kind of the union, and then to like from the individual practitioner. So if you want to kick that off, like what is holding more people back?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose there's two things, right? There's sort of taking action in an activist sense, like outside of the profession, and I'd say like getting involved in XR or Insulate Britain or something like that. You know, you can be from any walk of life and do that, really. I think for me, there's a great possibility or a great sense of, power and the ability to really shift the Overton window through those sorts of things outside of your day job. So that's sort of why I've got involved in that, and I'd like to I've tried to sort of encourage other people, I guess, within my sphere to also consider that as an option. But then there's also the sort of second thing of being within the industry and trying to sort of change the way that the industry functions. So I think both are really important, and some people feel more comfortable in one or the other of those sort of streams, I suppose. But in terms of like why there's this sense of like fatalism, I don't know. I think like architects and like middle class professionals, we are quite a sort of narrow demographic, aren't we? In a way, often. And I think there's all sorts of social conditioning that comes with being from that demographic. So like personally, it was very difficult to get involved in activism. Like it felt very uncomfortable, to put yourself in a situation where you're going to be getting in trouble and, you're sort of doing things that are open to criticism by the sort of mainstream perspective. That's deeply uncomfortable, and so I think it's an aversion to that. I think that's one of the things that's at play. But
cheers. So even from the perspective kind of UBW, have you had any members kind of having problems with saying no? So like retracting our consent, because we are like the 40% industry hasn't lost that bad for 50 years. And that's the mental strain of that is pretty huge. And I knew when applying for jobs, I could not bring myself to apply to most places at all, even seeing what they build. I couldn't be a part of that. But have you ever had any members who've kind of retracted that consent, and then that's caused run into kind of difficulty in that workplace or that environment?
In terms of retracting consent for working on like a environmentally destructive project, that should be on our agenda and on the horizon, but to my knowledge, it hasn't happened in architecture yet. I know there's a really inspirational example that we use a lot in the trade union of the green bans. They were in New South Wales, so around Sydney in Australia in the 70s. And actually construction workers are, inspiring. They took action as part of a trade union and blocked something like 4 billion in today's money worth of development. So stopping building on like Aboriginal bushland. Actually saying, no, we're going to down tools and we're not going to work on this project. Architectural workers have a lot to learn. And maybe that kind of touches on this idea of class or middle class comfort. We're told in architecture that if you don't like something, raise at an office meeting, or why don't you go off and do some research about it? Or if you really don't like it, maybe you should go to a different office, maybe somewhere. You're told that in this market of all these different architectural practices that there'll be, one which is a bit more critical, a bit more sustainable. It should be about changing where you are. That kind of privilege to hop around doesn't exist for everyone, or exists for maybe no one. I think saying no to things is really where we need to be in terms of changing things.
Fantastic. So even to move into the more kind of the arts, because we've got It's Freezing in LA that had kind of brings together arts and climate change, and then Phoebe who brought arts and climate change together quite literally. So even to talk about the kind of the place of kind of designing the future, like what type of spaces we can, because we all know that we have pretty much all the solutions in the built environment. Like we've been able to build things like a passive house for 30 years, so we're like 30 years behind where we could be. The average new built home is 6 times worse than a passive house, and that's legal. That's our legal bare minimum is so incredibly low. But just what is the place of the people who are imagining that future and designing it? So to start with Martha, what could that look like from the perspective of not just working in the built environment, but realizing a different vision of the future? Because we know we can do it. It's just that we've been taught and conditioned and socialized to kind of not admit what's physically possible.
Yeah, I mean, I find this, I get asked this question a lot because if you've not seen it, Freezing LA, we use a lot of illustration. We've got an amazing designer, and it's we try and make a really beautiful object that people really want to keep and like engage with more deeply. So people ask us a lot about the kind of role of art, and I'm sort of struggling to put together a few ideas, I think, in this space. But I feel like the point about imagination and the point about the built environment, I felt really strongly when I was in practice that I was just always discouraged to be imaginative. I was always encouraged to do the tiny pocket of the project that I was given well and quickly and, with nice slideshows or whatever. But I was never rewarded for saying, but what's that person over there doing? Because actually I think maybe we shouldn't be doing this at all, or whatever it might be. And I think when you're in a creative space, or certainly one that you run with other people, but sort of can make decisions in, you have complete freedom to sort of start again and to think really broadly and deeply. And I think I struggle with that just being a thing about the arts, because it should be what we do as people working in the built environment as well. The point of being a good designer should be about thinking really broadly and deeply who is going to be affected by this, how they're going to use it, how can we talk to them, what's going to happen to the environment, what happens better. And I don't think it's that the arts can do it and designers and urban designers shouldn't do it. It's just the arts have got that more accepted within them. So it's Freezing LA, we can just fly with that. We can get someone to illustrate a really technical piece and make people see what it feels like and sort of smells like even. But we just don't really do that yet in lots of urban spaces. So I'm not sure I very coherently answered that, but I guess for me it's about working with other people, it's about putting things on paper, it's about inspiring people, but also being inspired and then finding new ideas through that as well. But I don't think that should be about an art space. I think that should just be about a, not profit-defined, timetable-defined way of working in other sectors as well.
All right, thank you very much. So just to kind of pass to Phoebe for how did you find it in not just kind of stepping into power by yourself, but stepping into power surrounded by other people taking the climate crisis seriously? Because in conversations we've had over this past 2 days, it's been suggested the number of people in the built environment taking it remotely, vaguely, half seriously, is about 0.5 to 1%. So it's very, very scarce. But how would you describe it in kind of finding that collective encouragement? Or is that empowering? How have you found being surrounded by people who feel similarly and are taking it seriously?
Empowering is probably the biggest word. I mean, primarily how I feel about the climate crisis so often is fear and rage and despairing, and I think it's very hard not to as a young person when you see this catastrophic future that's being laid out for you, and you're aware that there are so many solutions in place that are just not being implemented. But the community that we have in people taking action for the climate, but particularly in Just Stop Oil, is the thing that gives me so much hope. It can feel very alienating being 21 and being a climate activist, especially having been to prison and being on a curfew tag for 3 months. It's not particularly normal uni student lifestyle, but the community in Just Stop Oil is incredible. These are the most brave, brilliant and beautiful people I know. And having these other people that are imagining a better, fairer society with you, you suddenly feel not alone, and you realise that it is possible, that we don't have to live this catastrophic future in terms of the climate and in terms of reimagining social justice as well, because they're all related. The climate crisis is uniquely unifying in that everybody will be impacted, and people who are already in oppressive circumstances are going to be hit first, and they're going to be hit worst.
All right, so something that has kind of come up repeatedly, and not just the work that I do with Anthropocene Architecture School, so lots of that, the kind of unifying thing for that was, as much as I did lots of teaching around the technical solutions, you can teach 5,000 people and absolutely fuck all happens, nothing changes. But if you can start kind of connecting with people more, so the space of the radical imagination of what we can do and where we could go, is something for me that I find quite encouraging, but the imagination came up quite a few times, and just like in Tom's kind of the denying of the Heathrow stuff happening, or in the Greenbelt, the downing tools, like these people imagined that they weren't just being part of a cog in a wheel. But what is the place of the imagination in design, Aska? If you would like to kind of, in architecture school, I was never once in 5 years asked to use my imagination. So like, that wasn't within that was in living memory, so that was very, very close. So in your own work in organising, like, does that come up as you talk collectively? Like, is that something that's a theme?
Yeah, so the organising conversation, it sounds like a special conversation, but actually I think we kind of do it all the time. It's between two or more people. You start off by talking about the world as it is, figuring out what's wrong with it, the things that you don't like, the things that are bothering you, maybe bothering the other person too. Usually try and do a bit more listening than you do talking. And then you do a bit of thinking about visions, the future, ways to change. Then you start to make a strategy to get there. So moving from like a specific issue, the desired outcome, and then thinking about steps along the way. And by the end of the organising conversation, hopefully you've agreed one of those actions and you get a little bit closer. And yeah, I think architecture is this kind of like propositional, like change-focused industry or profession. But yeah, we're making new buildings, but to kind of perpetuate an existing system which is so entrenched. And I think the everyday conversations of workers can start to like give you a bit more elbow room outside of that. It's just about the vision element. I think that's one way to do it.
Yeah, just continue on the kind of vision theme. So like, Martha, with It's Freezing in LA, how often do you have people from kind of built environment backgrounds reaching out? Is that something like, how imaginative have you found architects to be, and be like as blunt as you want as well?
That's a good question. We get some quite weird ones. We get a lot of people wanting to talk about that, like something they did to their house, which is cool. Like, that's important. I don't know. I would say that it's a strange thing that the like architectural journalism and architects are extremely different species and don't seem to write from reality. Like, because I find it as well. I work in policy now, and I draw so much from my time working in the real world, and I feel like it's going to get outdated quite quickly. So I guess point being, it often feels like people writing about architecture don't really think about the process of making things and then the people who are affected by it. It's all very form-based. It's all very kind of, does it meet the regulations or not? So I'd say it's sort of kind of imaginative, because I think people do point out interesting things, but it also just feels quite disconnected from what's actually going on. But that, that I really enjoy, because I've got a built environment background, it's one of my favourite things is to find people who have really interesting ideas on it. And there are so many great architectural publications at the moment, like After Party, I think, has been connected to here. New Architectural Writers Foundation do really good stuff. So I feel like there are some really fabulous built environment writers out there. But yeah, it's a strange thing getting pitches. I don't know if any of you've done it, but we get some really odd ideas, but it's quite fun. So.
Oh, fantastic. So even just to pass to Tom, and that kind of notion of like vision, and what have you found to be the most kind of nourishing thing for that? Like, from studying and then moving into architecture, what's been the most nourishing thing on not just stepping away from it?
Yeah, I think, an area where those two things have overlapped is, say, like protest architecture, which is a sort of an interesting scene or sort of emerging phenomenon. But yeah, I think a lot of the things XR have done sort of inhabit this interesting space between something that is a proposition but is also oppositional. So I'm thinking of the pink boat, like the pink table, the various tensegrity kind of towers that have been erected in different places. So yeah, there's a lot of imagination and creativity that goes into designing those actions. And that is a space where, yeah, having an understanding of construction, being able to read drawings, like these sort of basic skill set can be quite helpful. So I see some overlap there, I think. And my colleague Nick is, I think I'm allowed to say this, kind of writing a book about this at the moment, kind of documenting the history of that. So yeah, that should be available soon at all good bookstores.
They're fantastic as well. So, because I'd say can you raise your hand in the room if you work in architecture, study anything built environment? Like, can we just have raise of hands? So we have, well, most of the room. So we all have a very particular view of space. So just to ask, knowing all these solutions that are possible, Phoebe, what can and should the future start to look like in terms of how are we creating space? How are we living? Because we've got a very particular atomizing way of designing at the moment. Like, we scattergun people out in different places. We don't have places for connection. But lots of us have had an education in a very particular way about how you should design things like housing or public spaces. But from your own perspective, what can and should that look like? Like, we know the climate crisis is going to hit, but what would it look like if we did everything you know that's possible? So what could our spaces look like in our housing and otherwise?
Well, luckily I do have no experience in architecture, but if some of if all of the solutions we have available were implemented, it would look less like, trying to mop up a puddle with the tap still on full blast, because that's what we're doing at the moment, trying to adapt rather than, tackle the climate crisis. And there's going to become a level of consequence which we can't adapt to. And I think if all the solutions that we had available were implemented now, then there's more space for imagining a better world. We wouldn't just be trying to mop up with the tap still on in terms of dealing with the climate crisis, but in other issues in society at the moment, it feels like so many people are just having to survive, with the cost of living crisis, which is part of the cost of oil crisis. It's both one crisis, the crisis of greed. And there would actually be a space for imagining a fairer and a better and a healthier society.
Oh, thank you very much. So even So even kind of start with Tom and go back, we'll work backwards again, but so we have all these solutions in the built environment, and the blocks for them are not just a lack of imagination or a lack of design skills. Like, we know that we've got them, and it's systemic. It's a system that is entirely dependent upon perpetual growth and sacrifice zones. Like, we cannot shy away from that. Kind of Max Haven said to not be able to see this as a crisis of capitalism is a failure of the imagination. So what is the beginning of the unraveling of that? Because the architect is so deeply entangled in this system that is entirely sustained by damage. And even practicing sustainably is damage control. All sustainable design is voluntary under a current system. So where do you think the beginning of unraveling that starts?
Yeah, I mean, I think about this as three things. So you've got the problem, and often people think, okay, there's a problem, so what's the solution? And we've also got a lot of solutions now. Like, if you map the Rotterdam Biennale this year was really interesting because they mapped all the things that have happened in the sort of realm of environmental architecture over the past sort of century. Super interesting. But there's a third thing, right, which is the mandate. So, like, the impetus or ability for these solutions to actually happen and to scale up. And so, for me, that's where sort of stepping outside of the industry and engaging with social movements that are pushing for change is really key. And beyond directly getting involved in those groups, I don't have all the answers for how that should happen, but I think it is something that our industry should spend more time thinking about. Like, how do we not only come up with great model homes or write an amazing book on how to retrofit stuff, but how do we engage with the political reality and sort of shift society to a place where that's actually going to get implemented? So I think, yeah, I don't know what the answer is, but I think that's a question that we need to reorientate ourselves towards, because it's there's a tendency, right, to jump straight from problem to solution and forget about this other thing that's needed.
Yeah, if Martha, do you want to pick up on that, just kind of from there?
Yeah, I mean, my answer was going to be a bit different. I think in terms of pushing change, I totally agree. I think social movements are the only possible way we can get that momentum. I think in terms of like the real kind of unlocking real barriers, my work now is on the financial sector and how for-profit finance is the hook into carbon consuming and ecologically and socially destructive societies. Because when I was working, whenever you tried to get to the root of the problem, it always came down to who was paying for it and how they'd got that money and what the use of that money was doing to the people who had to rent the home or, whatever. And I think that does really strongly link day to day to your choices as an architect or as someone working in the built environment. When I worked at Bureau Happold in practice, I would always hear, oh, but, this is what the client wants, so we have to do it. We'll try and push back, but it's what the client wants. And there was never any discussion of maybe we shouldn't work with that client. Maybe that is something, we shouldn't go towards. And people would sort of justify it as, oh, but, we can push back on them more than other people might. And it was just like, that's delusional. That's just not going to happen. So I think, if we're talking about imagining what the future looks like for the built environment sector, I think I was talking to someone here earlier. I think what that looks like is architects working on really small projects that are about retrofit and maintenance and upgrades, and they're not these big, sexy capital development schemes. They're really boring, helping people get their gas boiler out safely and upgrading their really old home. And that is about your choice of client. That is about who you choose to take money from. That is about the financial system. So I would say it's exactly that. It's choosing what money you take and how you spend it as well.
Yeah, Aska, would you like to kind of expand upon that? So what's this, in untangling that, what is the space of specifically unionizing and collective organizing in the industry?
Yeah, I think in order to have change, and I guess from a trade union or worker perspective, your power in the workplace, it's because you're doing the work, you're doing the drawings, you're making the measurements, you're coordinating whatever gets built. So being able to withdraw that, if you withdraw as an individual, you're very easily dismissed from your job. But if you do that collectively, you have strength. And with the green bands, they were able, the density that they had in terms of union membership, even if the employer or the client brought in so-called scab labour, so people who are willing to break the strike, other building sites would then join the strike as well. So they were able to force the developers' hands. So yeah, power and change has to come from collective action, and the the greater the number, the stronger the power.
Yeah, so Phoebe, would you like to kind of build upon that? Kind of how are we, kind of from the perspective of you've not set foot in the built environment sector working was probably quite a blessing. So when it comes to building that kind of community, what have been the most kind of the things that have nurtured that the most you've found between yourselves and other people in cultivating that sense of building power collectively?
I think one thing is that people need to remember that they're not powerlessness. The reason I engage in some resistance is because I know it's where my power is. As a 21-year-old, I'm fairly politically disempowered. I can't make change in a sector that I'm working in. So I know that civil resistance is where my power is. And it's an incredibly powerful feeling being surrounded by other people taking the same action. It's a really big, scary thing to do, going out and getting arrested. It was even bigger and scarier going out thinking that I was going to be sent to prison. But when you're doing it with other people, you can't help but have to draw on each other's power and build this power together, because it's not something that a person can do alone, build up that bravery and have the courage to do it. And I wouldn't have survived being in prison without being in there with other people who had taken action on the N25. I would never have built up the bravery to go and throw soup on Van Gogh sunflowers if Anna hadn't have been by my side. So I think there's a sense of feeding off of each other's power, and when you see the power that you have together, it just keeps growing.
So in kind of drawing all the kind of threads we have, like collectively, we can say no. There is resistance isn't just always kind of aggressively forward, it can be retracting labour. Because we have so many projects that could not function, could not go ahead if the built environment sector were to say no. So we have things like HS2, we have the proposed expansion of airports that we know are incompatible with any form of justice, social, environmental, or intergenerational. So, Tom, if you want to kind of pick up on that, because you've been involved in doing things yourself and collectively, and the kind of the Architects Climate Action Network, and where do you see groups like that going in the industry? So, are they going to be kind of becoming more specifically focused? Are they going to are they going to have to go outside the industry more, or is it going to have to go towards like actions other than campaigns? Like, where is that going in your mind?
Yeah, I mean, I think ACAN's a really interesting example because it's a group that is working to change the industry sort of within the parameters of the industry, but it's also engaging with the political system and doing campaigning and that sort of thing. So yeah, I think, I don't know where that's going to go, but I think there needs to be more of that generally. I'd sometimes refer to it as like an inside-out strategy, like a donut, right? You've got the industry inside the donut, and that needs to change. But you also need to engage with everything that's outside of that. So I think a group like ACAN could be a big vehicle for doing that. Yeah, jumping back quickly to your point about sort of future imaginaries, there's two books that came to my mind. Has anyone read Heat by George Monbiot? Anyone read that? Martha's nodding. Or Ministry for the Future. So both those books are like quite broad-ranging and look at like what could the transformation look like? So I think it is like quite helpful to have someone sort of who spent the time thinking about all these different areas of the puzzle and like what it could look as one picture. That's Morgan.
Oh, Scott, let's get Morgan in.
In England, all calls are logged and recorded and may be listened to by a member of prison staff. If you do not wish to accept this call, please hang up now.
Hi, Morgan.
Hello, Tom.
Hello. You are on mic. So,
Oh, wicked. Sorry, I was a few minutes late. I was just putting some finishing touches on one of my essays on Unlearning Powerlessness, actually.
good stuff.
Strangely enough.
Just can everyone hear what's coming through? So it's a little bit muffled. Might hold it a little bit closer. So hi Morgan, it's good to hear you again. It's been quite a while. So just at the moment, would you like to kind of introduce yourself and what was the why behind your actions with Just Stop Oil? And just kind of from the perspective of like, I know you're an engineer, but just to kind of really give your full, what was it that was, what got you involved in kind of climate activism outside of the industry, and what was the kind of the tipping point for you as well?
I couldn't really hear the question. Do you want to repeat it closer to the phone, or should I just
Yeah.
go with what I'm guessing you said?
Right, well, Tom's going to pass me the phone. We're going to try again. So, could you introduce yourself to our audience who can't currently see you, and introduce yourself, and also what was it that got you to start getting involved in climate activism outside of the kind of parameters of the construction industry, and like what is your why as well? So, yeah.
Okay, sure. So, I've been, my profession before doing all this activism stuff still is, structural civil engineering. Mostly been doing bridges for the last like 12 years. Started in New Zealand as a structural engineer, did some like building stadiums, all kinds of things. And lately bridges, mostly in India, where they're actually building lots of things. That's where we've designed quite a few big ones. And, well, in 2019, I I got involved in Extinction Rebellion basically because I knew some people who were in the core of it. And I knew them because I worked at a co-working space in Islington called Hub Islington, which attracts a lot of social enterprises, just startups, just people wanting a nice, sociable workspace with good vibes. And because I had a friend from there who was organising some of the preparation festivals of XR, I felt very comfortable and confident just going and doing things at full speed from like February 2019. And sort of juggled my engineering work with that ever since, and did lots of interesting stuff in XR, especially making bamboo tension structures and towers for rapid deployment as blockades and barricades. That was been quite a wild ride. And in 2022, I then took part in the Just Stop Oil campaigns, like climbing on tankers and oil depots in April to just literally stop the fossil fuel system. And in October, they climbed the QET Bridge to make the nation consider that our way of life, keeping on drilling more oil, is literally killing people, has been for years now, and then will continue to kill more and more people if we continue it. So I felt it was time for drastic interventions, because we really don't see an emergency response from our government that's commensurate with the death and also in the heartbreak of people who are having to abandon their homeland because they're becoming uninhabitable. So that's why there's something really drastic like climbing the QET Bridge for 2 days. What's the next question? Is that everything you needed to know?
Just to kind of expand as well, because your background is in engineering, and something that's came up is the difficulty in stepping away in construction. So like not wanting to feel like you failed and making a difference, so you stay like in that system. What was the tipping point for you when being a sustainable engineer wasn't enough?
Well, in the heavy civil bridge designing, constructing business, there's really no latitude to affect anything other than the most competitive design in the market, to the costs of the way all this heavy civil stuff is done. So in my job, there's, apart from just doing really good designs to make lighter weight structures, unless I sort of completely left and found some research company to work in on new types of concrete or something, I didn't see any way to do anything in my job, because it's a competitive market, and the cheapest designs will win, and it's just you're a cog in a big machine. But a very interesting cog, like you did really interesting stuff, but I didn't feel like I had any agency to do anything but create the cheapest, most efficient designs. So I didn't attempt much like professional activism within my job, apart from speaking at conferences and mentioning that a few conferences that the pollution generated by these huge things we're constructing is a massive problem, and even making small increments on the efficiency and weight of the things we're building is really, it's never going to be enough. Like, we can make things slightly better, but we're never going to undo the harms of heavy civil construction by being cleverer engineers with the materials and systems we've got.
Right, thank you very much, Morgan. It's really lovely to hear you again as well. So to kind of continue on the engineering theme as well, that kind of being the cog and like the efficiency, what would imaginative engineering look like, Martha? So like, to actually use the imagination and using engineering to tackle the climate crisis outside of this entirely for-profit kind of race to the floor. What could and should it look like in your mind's eye?
Well, I think this... I'll give that to Morgan.
Yeah, you can jump in first, that's fine.
Well, what I found was that when I was put in a completely different problem space, like how to occupy space that the authorities didn't want us to occupy with, I like immediately started thinking, what do I do with my specific skills, which is engineering, designing structures. And so I worked with a sculptor, like a generation older than me, to create these deployable bamboo towers. And it was just the perfect application of everything I'd ever studied, and all the skills I'd honed in the professional engineering environment were just applied just beautifully to this. And it's been amazing. Like, people have built them in, I don't know, like 6 or 8 different countries as well. And now we do them for Glastonbury Festival as a sculptural big centerpiece of one of the areas. So we're taking the message in a soft, sort of soft power way out to the entertainment world and big audiences, and hopefully we'll work out how to convey the message that we're in a climate ecological emergency into more spaces by taking our innovative engineering architectural things to different events. So I never would have guessed any of that when I started going to my first XR meeting, but once you decide that once you decide you have to throw everything at a problem, you suddenly find you're going in amazing directions.
Right, I'm just going to pass across to Martha. So thank you very much, but do you want to kind of build on the engineering side? Because it would be great to have a second engineer. We now have 2 engineers on the panel. It's fantastic.
Yeah, it's the Romeo and Juliet of the engineering world, bringing engineers and architects together. I think that the space that I think hasn't been fully imagined yet is the circular economy space. People talk about a lot and use circularity as a kind of buzzword, but actual serious conversations about the infrastructure that's needed to deliver that just do not exist at all. So, actually building a physical space that is a material bank where all the materials that come in are quality checked and catalogued and organised such that architects and contractors and designers can then specify and plan to use them in their buildings. And that's a huge imaginative challenge. How do you build a flow of bricks and mortar and physical materials across the whole country? So I think there are, we clearly do have all the technologies and techniques we need to build sustainably and for different designers to work together to do that. But I think there are infrastructure challenges that still need to be created, and that is an engineering infrastructure challenge that hasn't been resolved yet. And it's a really frustrating one because people talk about circularity all the time in such a meaningless way. And they talk about, concrete is so bad for the communities we take concrete from. And to not use concrete is not zero carbon concrete, whatever that is. It's having systems where you can reuse materials at home. And that requires someone to fund it and someone to organise it and design it and actually do it. And it's always bottom of the list. I was at a policy group, trying to influence the political parties' manifestos, and it was this really weird system where everyone had come up with ideas of policies they wanted the Labour Party to adopt, and then all the different policy professionals voted on what they thought the most important ones were. And because everyone in the room worked on fuel poverty, which is extremely important, all of the answers were about energy use. And it was just one of those things where you just think, this is not in the popular conscious. People will say circularity all the time and not actually think about materials and buildings, and it's the biggest thing we can do to make our new buildings more sustainable, and it's just not on the agenda at all. But low carbon concrete is everywhere, and it's completely meaningless. So I said that was a real rant, sorry, but that would be my answer. I think there's huge imagination in materials that hasn't been realised yet.
So kind of keep on that kind of circularity, like with Tom, in your work as an architect, so like outside of kind of an activist space, how hard is it to reuse materials? So like we've got this wonderfully beautiful, buzzwordy circular economy as if it will like save the world, silver bullet, but the practicalities of doing it that are there, it's not something that it's not as easy as specifying something new. So like, what was the last time you tried to kind of do that on a project and kind of put that to use?
Yeah, I'm probably not a very qualified person to talk about this, to be honest. But yeah, I mean, I think with some materials it's relatively straightforward, right? Like bricks, you can go to a rec yard and talk to the chaps in the rec yard and get some reclaimed bricks. That's pretty established. For other materials, it's obviously trickier. Like you don't know what kind of state they're in, and yeah, there's issues to do with that. I mean, yeah, the kind of UBuild thing that we're surrounded by is part of trying to have something new that is circular. So it's sort of in that tradition of like demountable system builds. So that's been my main sort of interaction, I suppose, with the idea of circularity. But that's not really a sort of reclaimed material thing because it's sort of still virgin materials, but yeah, at some point it could become a reclaimed thing if someone builds with UBuild and then demounts it. But yeah, just to say, everyone, if you didn't gather, Morgan is speaking from HMP Chelmsford, where he's currently detained awaiting trial in about 2 weeks' time. I think is your trial, Morgan. So yeah, I just if that wasn't clear.
So, right, can we have a round of applause? There we go. And just on a personal note, Morgan, thank you very, very much for saying yes to the weird ask of being on a panel and to speak. And thank you so much for sharing as well, because it does mean a hell of a lot. So thank you. So to kind of, we've asked, so we'll jump back to Phoebe afterwards. But Morgan, you know very well that we have so many of these kind of solutions in the built, not even to call them solutions is like kind of a bit demeaning, but we have all these things we can do to realize a greener future that is a just transition. But what would that look like to you if we put every single technology you know is possible into being in our built environment? If we started kind of actually pushing for a just transition, what would that look like to you? So like in say like 5 years' time, if we did everything that you know is necessary and possible, what would the future look like?
Well, I've experienced something of the feeling of creating that by being stuck in prison, because you end up working on something, say it's just the legal defense for our trial coming up. When you live and work with someone on a mission, you rapidly develop a really strong momentum, and I like think back to historical times, like things like the Bletchley Park project, that when there's an existential threat, you put all the best people for a certain problem onto one campus, and if they all know that it's an existential threat and that they are the people that need to come up with answers for things, I think amazing things will happen in a pressure cooker environment like that. And that's what I kind of dream of being part of, I guess, after I've done this prison time. And I just think I want to tell that story because it would speak to so many other people on the other side of the political spectrum, you know, the sort of backbone conservative types, because you know there's really good things in the history of Britain that showed that amazing things could be done. Like when there was an existential problem, Alan Turing decided he needed a computer, and they didn't exist, so he just designed one and invented it just to solve the existential threat at that time. So there's so much stuff like that can be done, and it'll be, frankly, the most thrilling thing you could ever hope to work on.
Thank you very much for sharing that. That's really touching as well. Cheers. Cheers, Morgan.